that the United States in general, or possibly just particular police departments, should move to a requirement that new police officers would hold a bachelor's degree. The goal of this proposal, I think, is to increase the quality of officers and decrease the amount of complaints that we get. I think this is misguided for a few reasons. On the one hand, for the most part, when we require people of a particular profession to hold college degrees, it's because the profession is theoretical or requires some theoretical knowledge that can't really be taught on the job. Like, there are obvious reasons why we need nurses, engineers, accountants, and so on to have degrees, but it's not really clear how that would apply to police work, especially sort of low-level police work that new cops would be doing. And especially if the degrees that we're requiring would just be any bachelor's degree instead of a degree in some related field like criminal justice. There have obviously been a lot of objections that Americans have had in recent years to the behavior of police officers, but most of these are not the sort of things that could be remedied by requiring college degrees. There are a lot of moral objections, frankly, to certain actions by police, objections that certain police officers have been putting their own safety or whatever over the safety of the civilians that they're tasked to protect. There are also objections that relate to the way police officers have made judgments or snap judgments. Like, there are stories every now and then about cops who will mistake a kid holding a toy gun for some kind of a threat and kill them. And there are objections to the way that police are held accountable in society and to the legal rights that they have, like the right to qualified immunity and civil asset forfeiture in particular. It's not really clear how any of these objections would be dealt with by requiring higher qualifications for police officers. I don't think that getting a college degree is going to make somebody better at making decisions under high amounts of pressure. I don't think it's going to increase someone's moral character either. In fact, you could make the argument that lowering the pool of applicants is going to make it, on the one hand, harder to hire cops in a time when we already have a nationwide police shortage. And especially, it's going to be, given the difficulty of hiring cops is going to go up, it's going to make it harder to hold police accountable. Just like in any job, the more difficulty you have filling a position, the more motivation you're going to have to keep somebody around, even if their performance is questionable. Lastly, the United States in the past has had a problem, in my opinion, of a drastic reduction in the amount of middle-class jobs available that don't require a degree. Whereas in the past, it was fairly easy to make a good middle-class wage right out of high school. Those opportunities are getting rarer and rarer. And police work is one of the few fields left where a regular person graduating high school can still hope to start work immediately and earn a pretty solid wage. And that is going to conclude my opening statement.
All right. Yeah, and thanks, Spaz, for taking on this debate, for volunteering this prop, because I think it's a really interesting proposition for one, and I think there's a lot of good points that you did bring up here, and I want to kind of set the stage for why I don't believe the proposition, why I do think police officers should be educated. And my counter argument would go something like this. Look at what we ask police to do in this country. Simply look at that, all the little things they have to do with their jobs. Police are expected to be social workers. Police are expected to be knowledgeable of the law and criminal procedure. Police are expected to be tactically proficient. When we look at how police are trained currently, typically what that's going to kind of be composed of is going to be some kind of post or a police academy, right? That will last several months. And most of this time is going to be spent on tasks like driving training, marksmanship, arrest procedures, right? And then after they do all of this, there's a little bit on all these information systems they have to use, how to write and file reports, escalation of force procedures, and things like that. And the reality is that we focus a lot of police training and skills in the wrong areas. what happens as a result of this, and maybe not even the wrong areas, maybe more accurately, they don't have enough time in post. And because these systems fail to educate them, what we do is we throw police officers into working jail. This is typically the procedure you'll see in states like mine, California. You'll see this also with several other states, where the police officers are going to be going hands-on with inmates in an area where their rights are definitely in controversial situations, making sure that these inmates are getting where they need to go for legal issues, proceedings, making sure that the inmates are getting good food, that they're safe, that they're not fighting with each other, making weapons, things like that. They're expected to do so much in this very closed off environment. And then after that, now they're going to somehow, because they practice marksmanship a lot, they had a couple 8-hour courses on procedures. Now suddenly they're supposed to be able to jump out into the real world and be proficient in a squad car with a partner, or more often without one. We are expecting police to do these jobs that require literally years of tactical training, require years of legal training in order to be competent in. And the simple fact of the matter is, if you're not competent in these procedures, at a practical level, you're more likely to get them wrong than right. It would be better for us to have police officers that are well versed in the law, well versed in people's rights, and aren't making it up on the spot or interpreting the law on the spot, because that's not really their function. Their job is to execute the law, to enforce it. Um, and if we're not giving the police these tools, then that's an issue. One other thing to note, if we want to talk about complex tasks that police have to do, is to look at traffic court, right? This is something that police do commonly. When you go to traffic court, it's not the district attorney typically presenting the case for, why you ran a red light and here's the evidence, or why you threw a cigarette butt out the window or something like that. It's typically just the officer. In this capacity, we're putting officers in the place of a lawyer as a prosecutor. Um, and the courts have kind of just redefined things in such a way to where whatever the police officer says gets taken for granted. They're able to effectively prosecute crimes that they arrested someone for. Uh, why shouldn't we have more rigorous standards for police that are going to be engaging in that? Um, it doesn't make sense. We want educated police officers. There's plenty of people with bachelor's degrees in the U.S. that are willing to take those jobs, and there's plenty of opportunity out there for people to get those educations. Um, when we talk about a lot of this stuff, right? We look at these ethical or moral objections to policing that aren't remedied by education. I would just disagree with that. When we talk about the ability to perform a legal analysis, like, hey, what is this? What are this person's rights in this situation? Or hey, how does organizational management work? How can I efficiently get my job done to reduce waste and spending and such? Where can I find ways to make the government more efficient and make law enforcement more efficient with respect to people's rights? These are hugely important questions, and these questions require people with degrees to be addressing. Further, to throw someone that's uneducated into these situations where they're making real-time tactical calls that have to factor in both legal threats, life and limb threats, property damage threats. It's very intense. I would rather someone have more knowledge than not and be more prepared than less prepared, and a degree lends itself towards that. So there's a lot there that we can respond to off of both of our opening statements, but I figure we can probably get started there.
Okay, cool. So one thing that you said that I object to is the idea of police immediately jumping into work after the police academy, a lot of times without a partner. My understanding is that in almost any police department, cops are going to spend at least about 6 months being basically babysat by a more experienced officer. They're not going to immediately graduate to police academy and then go on to like catch murderers or go out patrolling by themselves or anything like that. I've never heard of that happening. Another thing you brought up is the responsibilities cops have in traffic court. It might be true that in a way they're acting as sort of pseudo prosecutors. I don't know how big of an issue this is really going to be. given the low stakes that are typically in play at traffic court. If a cop fucks up and lets somebody get out of a ticket, I don't really know how much of a tragedy that is. It probably doesn't even really matter. Now, it's true that police have a large amount of responsibilities. I don't think it's true that the education that cops have is going to need to be on par with what a social worker has. I know people who go into social work, and from what I understand, it's the education requirements are pretty intense. I think you're basically nothing in social work if you don't have a master's, right? And I just don't
That's
think it's
yeah.
tenable. Yeah, I don't know how tenable it is to expect that amount of education from cops. The
So
last thing I was oh sorry,
go ahead.
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I
Yeah.
was going to
Let's.
say
Yeah.
the last thing I was going to say is even though there might be plenty of people who have bachelor's degrees, period, who are willing to go into police work, most of the benefits you listed are only going to apply if the person or if the applicant has a degree in something related, like criminal justice, maybe social work, maybe legal studies, something like that. But if you have a degree in psychology, engineering, whatever, it's not really going to have much of a benefit, right? And I don't know. I think right now there are about 1 million cops working in the U.S., and I think mm, there are less than a tenth of that in terms of people with degrees in criminal justice graduating now.
Sure. So yeah, so let's talk about how some of these more theoretical degrees kind of find their way in. So in the county that I live in, one of the things that a very experienced deputy told me was that when they were looking to hire, right, one of the things that they look to hire, in addition to the normal criminal justice degrees and people with previous experience as police officers, one of the things that they would look to hire was actually people with things like English degrees or degrees in humanities or degrees in the sciences. And the reason for that was because if someone has a literary degree or an English degree or some other humanity that they've studied, typically they're going to be strong writers. And when it comes to writing reports, that's immensely critical. Most of the police officer's job is paperwork. Which means that those degrees in business, those degrees in English, those degrees in these clerical processes and things like that that speak to that are helpful. When you get over to the sciences and things like that, and you're talking about police officers being able to investigate, financial crimes or being able to do other tasks there, right? Having knowledge of these disciplines is immensely important to understanding a lot more of these investigations and what's going on. Um, and we generally consider skills like engineering to be broadly practical anyway. But for the sake of the job, yeah, absolutely, these degrees, even in more abstract or theoretical things, do provide value. When it comes to the court procedures, the issue is not that someone may get off with a ticket or may not. The issue is, was that person's rights violated to begin with, right? There's so much court precedent going on to have a 6 or an 8 hour course and then call it good, and now you can bring your tickets to traffic court and prosecute these people. Probably not a sufficient level of knowledge. And to that point, yeah, that's why police do a lot of OJT. So whether or not police officers are kind of thrust out in the middle of nowhere by themselves or not after post, let's take that for granted. We're assuming that a few months of OJT is going to cover this stuff. It simply won't. There's no amount of on the job training that's going to prepare a police officer for every ethical issue that they face, for every moral issue that they face. And if I look at a standardized curriculum, which is why we have posts in the first place, yeah, it seems like that's going to cover more. The issue with Post is that it's going to focus on firearms training, driving, and a few of these 8 hour courses on basic kind of clerical issues or procedures, and it's not going to be enough to make sure that these things are correct, especially in the ever evolving world that the police officer lives in. So that's where the issue is. If they're more educated and we have kind of a set standard with education, we can see that the intelligence and the critical thinking skills are there well before post. It's not just monkey see, monkey do with the procedure. The police officer needs to be intelligent. They need to be critically engaging with things. They need to think about their role in the community and what they're doing. And yeah, that needs to extend to other disciplines. And so the question is it going to make more sense for police officers to have more education or less? The common sense answer seems to be, well, just get more education. Like the more they know, the more they train, the better, the better awareness they have of these things, the better they're going to perform in their job. And that seems to be so intuitive. I guess the question is why, like, do you think it's the case that educated police officers perform worse, or that it's not worthwhile, or is this simply no, I just don't think it's necessary as a requirement.
Yeah, it's going to be the latter one.
Okay.
So I can grant, and I'm sure that most police departments would probably accept that it's better to be more educated instead of less educated. But there's a difference between that and having just a strict requirement of to be a police officer, you have to have a bachelor's degree. I think, well, especially you should point out the variety of educational backgrounds that we're talking about. Sort of necessarily implies that. Well, so for example, you said, well, there are going to be different benefits from having something like an English degree compared to maybe a criminal justice degree, compared to
Mhm.
maybe a science or engineering degree. And when you talk about having people with these variety of backgrounds on, you're almost sort of necessarily implying that, well, you don't need the skills of an English major, you don't need the skills of a scientist, and you don't need the skills of an engineer to be a cop. And since an English major doesn't need to know the skills of a scientist, it's not clear why it should be a requirement.
Yeah, so the issue here, right, is that the education system doesn't just work, and I have an English degree, so English is the only thing that I know about, right? So that's kind of the I think the underlying implication with that. The reason that college is so valuable is that you study in a wide array of disciplines and you focus on one. But this wide array of disciplines that you're able to study and get more in depth on does provide that awareness. If I had it my way, I would require things like LLBs, I would require criminal justice, administration of justice degrees, things like that. If I had it my way, I would focus most of these around the law or forensic science, right? If I had it my way. And so I would say I would specifically kind of tailor to that. But what I am trying to say with this is that police officers do see a tremendous benefit to have educated officers as their coworkers, as their staff. They're already seeing that benefit, and that seems to do better for them. If I had to take a guess, and we have the people that are fresh out of post, a whole bunch of OJT, versus the people that had all of that plus the education, which one of those police officers is more likely to start a riot off of a bad arrest, right? And I knew nothing else about the officers other than one was educated and they have the same, and one was not, and they have the same amount of experience. My tendency would be to say, well, the educated person I suspect is less likely to have a bad arrest because they are more aware of the law. I think that's a reasonable inference, right? And so if it's going to reduce if it's more likely to reduce the amount of violations of people's rights, then it seems like an intuitive requirement. Um, it just seems like, well, yeah, this is a great this is a better standard than allowing continually allowing uneducated police officers into the system that make these bad calls, that ignore what the proper procedures are, or maybe that don't comprehend fully these procedures. The education requirement kind of gives a stopgap on the minimum required intelligence to be able to say, hey, you know what? Actually, no, this is the procedure, and this is what it means, and your lack of education that prevents you from properly understanding that and everything. Yeah, we can kind of screen that out, so we have a higher quality of officers as a result.
Okay, so just like I said earlier, I can grant that we would rather have more educated cops as compared to less educated cops. And I'm sure every police department or everyone who does hiring for police departments in the country would probably agree with that. But an interesting comparison we could make is whether you would prefer a cop with a bachelor's degree who just graduated the police academy compared to a cop who might have started work a little bit earlier and has a couple more years of experience.
Um, yeah, I don't think like I think apples to apples here. We have to look at when people are becoming cops in their lifetime with age requirements. So to really like look at if this question makes sense. So for a lot of departments, right? And in a lot of states, we have things where like handgun possession and things like that is not allowed until after you're 21. We're talking about the average person leaving high school. If the average person that gets a degree, leaving high school and going back to go get that degree after high school, and then having it around 21, 22. So I would say the probably the more likely comparison would be this police officer uh, that hits the streets. You know, let's say that they have their 6 months of post, their bachelor's degree, their 2 years in the prison, their 6 months of OJT on patrol, and now they're on their own. Versus a guy that has 18 months on his own after patrol with none of that education. I think I would pick the newer cop. If we're going apples to apples here. I
Okay.
think I would pick the educated cop. And it's just on that basis of like, hey, look, like if we're looking at how this practically plays out, if someone's functional wait time isn't stopped by 4 years to go get the degree and then apply, but it's really just they'd have to be a certain age requirement to be a cop anyway. And so they just get the degree in that time. And we just look at like, the most practical path to that, then it's like, well, okay, it's a year of experience versus like this person that's much more aware of how the world works and what's going on. And I'd rather that increased awareness with that education, hands down. And that's why I don't think it's an unreasonable requirement. Like at the end of the day, it's just um uh there's no amount of experience that's going to solve the problem for you.
Okay, so what's a little bit more likely than somebody graduating high school at 18 and then immediately becoming a cop? Which that does happen, by the way. There are a couple cops in my town who did that because
Sure.
the shortage of applicants was so intense lately. What's a little bit more likely from people I know is you would graduate high school. Maybe you would go to community college or something, but you would work in a semi-related field, like you would work as like a prison guard, maybe a security guard, something like that. And then later on, you would apply to be a police officer. It's not clear to me. No, I could be wrong. It's not clear to me that the benefits of having a bachelor's degree are going to be so overwhelming compared to a few more years of full-time work experience and something semi-related that the second person should be completely excluded from applying. And what this is going to go into is one of the things that I said in my opening statement that I don't think was ever addressed is one of the biggest objections that Americans have to the conduct of our police officers lately is just how difficult it is to fire cops who behave badly. And I think, given that we already have a problem with this now, just in any case that we increase the educational requirements for a profession, the people in that profession, the people who do meet those requirements, are going to have a lot better of an ability to negotiate for better wages, better job security, stuff like that. I don't have anything against cops having better wages, but well, as we've seen, it's already in some police departments, especially, it's almost impossible to fire police officers, even ones with pretty severe histories of misconduct,
Mhm.
right? Like I think Derek Chauvin had quite a few complaints made about him before he finally, before that incident finally happened, right?
Mhm.
In that situation, if we increase educational requirements for police officers, is only going to be getting worse and worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think the better approach to that, as opposed to addressing what a union is doing through lowering education requirements, I think the better approach would be to look at the powers of a police union and look at qualified immunity and look at these other aspects of law. So I think we get more by turning to the direct cause of those problems and what's directly enabling them. I don't think the education is doing that, and that case is unclear to me. I do agree not every ethics problem is going to be solved with education here, but I do think that what the education can provide more often than not, we see most degrees having some kind of ethics course for whatever's going through. So, for instance, if you're going to take a criminal justice degree, some kind of ethics of law enforcement or a legal ethics class is going to be pretty normal. A philosophy of law course, that type of thing, is going to be pretty normal. And you're looking at someone who's also getting exposure to these different types of systems and the different vocabularies used, the different kind of jargon and such, and legal jargon and police jargon is its own, other matter. Um, and you're looking at a direct study of that. So, like, if I have to have an uneducated cop um, and an educated cop both look at a Supreme Court decision and need to understand what it means with respect to someone's rights, like who's more likely to get that right, to make an accurate claim or statement, or make an accurate call in light of a SCOTUS decision, on something in real time in the field, right? And I'm thinking that the more educated person is going to do that. We can see that that's an ethics problem that can be solved with education, because the only thing that's going to make sure that you're understanding and interpreting legal language properly is to be educated in that legal language. And this is something where, yeah, some 8-hour course going over a couple important SCOTUS rulings is just not going to handle for you, or for any police officer. Um, and to that end, actually, I should add, there's a common joke about police officers with IQs under 100, because of these requirements. It's convenient in a sense to hire these kind of blockhead cops that make that consistently do make poor decisions, because they're not the ones sitting there and questioning, like, uh, how to do the job, or what's the right thing to do in light of what they're seeing and what they know. It's cops that just kind of follow orders, and that's the most dangerous cop of them all, in my view. Especially if we're looking into any kind of like tyranny or oppression put off or created by law enforcement and their interactions with civilians. So as far as that kind of ethics side, it's like, no, it's tremendously important that people are aware of ethics, and uh, uh, Post isn't going to do a fantastic job covering that, and it doesn't seem uh, like it's been doing a good job. I think the academies aren't really there for that. They're there to teach tasks and procedures. They're not there to teach an understanding. They're there to teach what to do, not the why or how. And as soon as anything gets more complex than the everyday, the why and how becomes very, very critical to doing a good job and to doing an ethical job, right? So if we're talking about then, right, and this is why it's just going to kind of keep coming back to that. It's just like, if we want to be ethical, shouldn't I understand ethics? Shouldn't I understand the world better? Shouldn't I be able to look at these situations with more background and more awareness and everything? And then if I have to choose between someone who's done that more and someone who's done that less, to be policing my population, to be out there with a firearm and telling people what to do, right? Just seems like, hey, I want that person who's studied. I want that for my citizens. So if I'm able to hire that person, that's who I should hire. And if I can make that a requirement, then I should. Um, I just threw out a whole lot there. I know, but I hope I hope that answers kind of that ethics point in more detail.
Okay, cool. So I think what's important to point out is that in the US, the way that our rights are protected is not by just trusting police or anybody else other than, I guess, judges. Well, even not really judges. We don't typically rely on having some sort of like enlightened philosopher for a cop who can know exactly what rights I have and just benevolently respect them at all times. We have an adversarial legal system where if somebody's rights are violated, they have the opportunity to seek compensation. And I think so long as nobody is severely hurt or killed, for the most part, the ability to seek compensation is gonna, or well, not just compensation, but the ability to have cases thrown out if your rights are violated by the investigators is going to be a sufficient bulwark against cops overreaching. Now, when I was in college, I did take classes in ethics and I took classes in the history of law. I don't know from the classes I took how relevant they would be to police work. Because in my experience, an ethics class is going to talk about things like, oh, this is utilitarianism, deontology, the opinions different philosophers have had historically about the way ethics works. Things like I don't know how relevant that is to police work on the ground. It seems like just like the objection that I had earlier, a lot of this is probably going to be a little bit too abstract to give much of a benefit to a beat cop, basically.
Yeah, so let's talk about kind of tying in ethics into these everyday decisions, right? So you can study these ethical systems, and sure, like utilitarianism isn't going to apply strictly to um every decision that a cop makes, right? And we can grant that, right? But when we look at it, when we look at say the history of the US, the history of the Constitution, things like that, and understanding that ethical basis, that's going to be immensely important, especially for the legal system. For a police officer of the United States, for any government official, the U.S. Constitution is the foundational ethical document from which all of these laws and interpretation issues are going to be following from. So you should probably have a good understanding of contractarianism, right? And understanding that these different interpretations of the Constitution as far as what it's going to mean when someone invokes their First Amendment right or their Fifth Amendment right. And if a cop doesn't have an understanding of what it means to invoke a legal right, then what's going to keep them from, say, ignoring someone's Fourth or Fifth Amendment rights, or what's going to keep them from doing that, right? The courts do have that job more than the officer. I don't think there's a doubt about that. But what we do see with law enforcement agencies now, like the ATF, or like the DEA, is that they are having to look at what they think the law is, um, interpreting the law and defining things into the law, which is already wrought with ethical issues. And then somehow they're supposed to, do the right thing in light of that. So we can say, well, doing the right thing doesn't matter for doing your job, but then why are we talking about the ethics of policing at all if that's the case, right? We see like the ATF, for instance, defining what NFA items are, even though the NFA offered some clear definitions on these items. And that's just as an example. The law enforcement agency is deciding what is and what is not legal because they've been given too much power, in my opinion. I would rather educated cops be looking at that than not. Now, you may say, well, this isn't this isn't really the job of these beat cops to be doing, but they kind of are doing it on the spot with these calls, in these one-offs, and further, uh, even if that's not the job of them, it's not just lawyers looking at this stuff and interpreting it. It is actual like law enforcement officers. You have captains and lieutenants and things like that that are looking at these things and having to make these calls on a regular basis. So it's not just that the education is important for the beat cop. Um, it's also important for the administration as a whole, for that entire kind of branch. And it is a concrete thing where they are making decisions every day based off of what they think the law is and what they think is ethical. So yeah, it is important that they have that. Um, it's kind of strange to say, well, like let's approach ethics, let's approach what we ought do, and then let's say that I shouldn't think about or study or be trained in what I ought do. Um, I should just kind of do my job. So it's like this strange kind of like ignorance of ethics until it becomes absurd that ethics are kind of mandatory to answer that ought question. And then, oh, okay, well, I should study it. I should take at least one college ethics course, maybe, so I can understand that. And it's just like, hey, look, get the people that have already studied it. Like, you don't want to, you wouldn't hire a mechanic that didn't train to be a mechanic, that didn't understand those things, especially if you were trying to engineer things. You'd hire a mechanical engineer. Um, it makes sense to have the education for what you want. It makes sense that that's going to be who's good for it. I don't know
Right.
if I'm getting through though.
No, I think I understand. So one thing I'd point out though is you were talking about decisions made by either high-ranking cops like captains and lieutenants, and you were talking about decisions made by federal agencies like the ATF.
Mhm.
And I very highly doubt that the people writing policy for federal law enforcement agencies have anything less than like a master's degree.
I
Just like
wouldn't be
how
surprised either way, like with its bachelor's or master's. I mean, like I would generally agree that it's more likely that they have some education. But I wouldn't say that I can claim that out the gate.
Okay. Either way, I don't think that the ATF is like hiring people out of high school or whatever to write their policies, right? I think we should probably expect that as you move up in the police force or as you join like a federal agency, there are going to be much stricter requirements as compared to the requirements we would have of a cop who basically a young person who's just joining the police force. I know the way the military works right now is you can enlist right out of high school, but to be an officer, you have to have a degree. We could probably have police departments do something similar. We could have educational requirements to progress past a certain rank. We could even have educational requirements to move from to increase in rank to the point of being like a detective, right? There probably will be some. Well, and I'd probably just say that I support that. You should probably be more educated the higher up you go in the organization. But I still disagree with requiring it for the lowest level.
Okay.
One more thing. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say. So you and I do have a lot of common ground. Then that at the very least we can agree these higher levels of law enforcement, when you start maybe certain levels of supervisors or specialists in tasks, absolutely do need the degree. Um, and that's fair enough. But yeah, go ahead and let's continue.
Um, so the last thing I was going to say is similar to the point I made earlier. We don't. I actually would not feel comfortable putting whether my Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights are respected in the hand of a police officer, no matter how educated they are, because the way the American legal system works is adversarial, right? Their goal is to convict you. And if we don't think that there are protections, if we don't think that I can seek either compensation or other protections against having my rights violated, I think we have a bigger problem than whether cops have degrees, right?
Yeah.
Like if it's up to a cop whether my Fifth Amendment rights are respected, for example, I think I am going to be in trouble, right?
Yeah, I would agree that that we are in trouble because of that, right? Like our Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights have been, as far as the legal side of them, have been eroded away tremendously, right? And in large part due to the establishment as a whole, um, which is taking these cases from these uneducated officers, running them through the courts, and you do have these big police unions and other things, right? Like you were talking about, I do agree that there's other ethical issues going on, where you do get these big lobbying interests that say things like, oh well, stop and frisk is constitutional, and things like that. Um, I was gonna say though, I wanted to snap back to the comment on military training and such, and I want to give just kind of an idea of that because I do have personal experience there. So I was a 37 Foxer psychological operations specialist for the U.S. Army, and my training for that was my basic training, which was about 10 weeks. After that, I went to AIT, my advanced individual training, right, for another 10 weeks, where I learned a whole bunch of administrative functions for my job. And that was in I was class, gosh, a 110 out of Fort Bragg for that. So that was in 2009, given the Army fiscal year. Um, After that, I wound up training with my reserve unit for a couple of years, and then wound up deploying to Iraq in 2011. By the time I get there, I am some psyop specialist, right? No college education, really, nothing substantial. I think maybe some college for me at that point in time. And I'm having to one, be able to do an immense amount of research. I'm having to do all this stuff to understand where people are coming from, demographics research, sociological research. I'm having to work with people with doctorates and master's degrees constantly. Compile that and then be able to say this is the advise directly on, this is the call, this is the message we need to put out, this is why, this is how effective it's going to be and such. There's no way that basic, like some understanding of like basic squad movements and marksmanship, and then 10 weeks of uh you know uh on and off with like classroom and driver training is going to prepare me for that task at all. And frankly, it did a little bit because I understood some terminology for the job, but the reality was that I was a 19-year-old thrust into a foreign war, having to make these like crazy, ridiculous calls, and direct millions of dollars of media budget. Um, that's not good. uh, that's not the best place to put some 19-year-old. And so if you're asking, well, would I rather that person, that soldier be doing that? And then you say, well, maybe a cop is more like an infantryman, Oh, okay. So we're going to spend, all this time training the infantrymen on these basic tactics, and they still have years and years of beating on their craft, ideally before they deploy. And then even then, you have them looking at war crimes. You have them looking at doing investigations and reading people into these military databases and working out communications and making these calls in the moment about like the lives of dozens or hundreds of people. Um, there's no amount of training that's just going to be like sufficient, and there's the denial of um and so like when we look at just that, right, and we just have to look like, is it more realistic to expect the better performance out of having some educational gate here? Yeah. The reason that we don't with the military, frankly, is that we use the military as a welfare program to get these people education. We use it because we need to get these massive numbers for war and things like that. But I don't want this low quality bar that like the army provides for this initial entry um, soldier, right? I don't want that to be the standard for the cop. I want to hold the cops to a higher standard. We're dealing with our own citizens. Why wouldn't we want the best?
Okay, so I guess I acknowledge the point about infantrymen spending a few years before they deploy the first time. I'll grant that. I'm not trying to say that because the military has a particular standard, then the police should have that standard. What I'm saying is the system where we have the enlisted officer divide can be a model for the police force as well. So we can require, or we can have fairly low requirements for somebody for an entry level cop, and we can increase those requirements as you increase in rank. And the reason I'm saying that is because the majority of the best points I think you're making are going to apply to higher ranking cops as compared to people who work traffic. And from what I understand of the way people typically progress through police work, you typically start off with your main responsibilities being things like traffic, and you actually have to be in the force for a few years before you start moving up to being like a detective or, God forbid, working SWAT or anything like that. And so you are going to have a few years of experience, sufficient time to get more education, and also opportunity to pursue a degree between being admitted to the police force and moving on to those higher roles with more responsibility.
Yeah, so I think maybe we should just narrow down the focus here to like let's narrow to traffic and this initial entry to law enforcement. So like traffic and jail, right? And and these very simple quote unquote things. One, I don't think traffic laws are inherently simple. We have lots of discretionary issues. So for instance, I can recall some statistics I was told back in high school years ago, right? Where it's like, hey, the average person's going to make like 4 traffic violations per mile they drive and such, right? And you have all these traffic violations happening and occurring. Which ones do you enforce and which ones do you not? That's already a massive ethics question where I would prefer an educational background informing that. Further, we also have the stops that are being made, right, by law enforcement officers, and each time a law enforcement officer pulls someone over, it's a unique situation, different details and different extenuating circumstances, um, especially when we're discussing things like DUIs and things like that, where the law can be very murky, where the standards of like forensics or the forensic science and things like that are very important. It's very important to get these procedures exactly right and to account for these variances in the situation. And you still have these situations where police officers are just flat out stopping someone. That person's rights may or may not be respected. But the outcomes from that situation can be informed greatly by an education in that moment. Um, Given that these situations are dynamic, and given that more information, more background, especially with critical thinking in the law, um, seems to afford better decisions for these cops. I like why not, right? Um, and I guess that would be my question. Like if we know the education helps, if we know these situations are dynamic, if we know that people's rights get violated all the time, and we don't like that, um, I don't think the system simply being adversarial is a pass here. It's like, you know, why why not just have the officers be educated and act in good faith in the first place?
Okay. Well, I feel like if I have a button that requires police officers to always act in good faith, then you would be an idiot not to press it, right? But we don't have any button like that. And the reason why I bring up the American system being adversarial is just that what it's going to mean is that if I don't have any way of ensuring that my rights are respected other than the beneficence of a cop, then the system is obviously not working at all, right?
Yeah, and that's like we said, like I think you and I agree there. I guess I'm trying to think of a way to rephrase it that maybe communicates it better. I- If someone's, would you agree that an untrained cop is less accountable than a more trained cop?
Uh, Actually, no. I would go the opposite direction. I would say that the less trained somebody is, on the one hand, the more accountable they are to their higher ups because they're more replaceable, and on the other hand, the less likely they're going to be able to be to pass off rights violations as being procedurally acceptable, right?
Okay. So yeah, so I disagree. And I think this might be like a core disagreement here. So the reason I disagree is that Um, while we may say ignorance of the law is no excuse, we do mean that in the context of an adversarial justice system. But when we apply things like quantify or qualified immunity, what have you, to cops, right? They do seem to get an ignorance of the law as an excuse for them. It does seem that uh, when I'm performing in a job normally, if I'm aware of what I should have done and I didn't do it, right? Or if I could have seen what an issue would have been and I couldn't do it, I'm more likely to be held accountable by my employer and get fired. So the idea here would be, well, hey, look, these cops are more educated now. They understand the law. They understand the broader context of these things. They understand the broader context of the society they live in better than if I threw them through 6 months of training and just kind of slap them into the jail, slap them into a squad car with an FTO and send them out. Now I can say, look, like you're educated, you're aware, you've been doing this job for a while. You should have seen this coming, right? And that's something that's a better argument to make if the cops are educated, for the sake of police accountability, um, than not. So to me it seems backwards to say that because someone's more educated or more aware, that they would be less accountable for their actions. Like the reason that I don't hold my son accountable for spilling a drink the same way, I get mad if like my wife spilled coffee the other day, spilled my coffee the other day. I was very upset. But the reason that I'm less upset when my kid does it is because the kid didn't know any better, right? And and with more education, that means there's more stuff where the officer does know better, right? And I can hold them more accountable. So if we're talking about these broader ethical problems, I do think education in that sense gives us the key to really alleviating a lot of that tension and a lot of those issues.
Okay. So let me try to rephrase my point about the adversarial system because I think I'm not getting it across either. So it seems to me like when we talk about the way somebody's rights can be violated by law enforcement, they're going to be, I'm going to divide it into two categories. The one category is sort of, the one category is going to be issues relating to somebody's being prosecuted or officially punished for a crime. And the other one is going to be the way somebody is treated on the scene by police, right? So we can have issues of somebody obtaining evidence illegally or, like you said earlier, ignoring somebody's Fifth Amendment rights or illegally searching an area or something like that. And then we can have issues of people being assaulted or killed by police. And I think if we have, if education reduces those violations, it's going to mainly be reducing the first kind. It's going to be reducing things like procedural violations, and it's going to reduce instances of like police violating more obscure laws. It's not going to have as much of an effect as any on issues like the George Floyd killing or other police killings that are made in the heat of the moment. And I'm saying, with respect to rights violations that are occurring in the just, let me think about this. When we're talking about police violating people's rights, with respect to people who are about to be prosecuted, we already have a system for that, and it's the court system, because you have the opportunity to have a lawyer who can argue to get you remuneration or to have your case thrown out if cops acted illegally. And I think we have to be able to rely on that system because, well, we have to be able to rely on it because that's the only way that we have of protecting people's civil liberties. And you were talking earlier about things like people's civil rights being eroded by like qualified immunity, maybe civil asset forfeiture, stop and frisk, stuff like that. Those decisions are made by some of the most powerful, educated, wealthy people in society. They're not made by guys who graduated high school and joined the police force. And I don't understand how requiring more education for beat cops is supposed to fix things like that.
Yeah, so let's talk about how education helps an adversarial system function better then. So the reason that education matters in an adversarial system, right? So like let's do the easy and I'm not claiming this is your position at all. So this is just as a hypothetical. Why do we want police officers to receive administrative training in the first place on any of the processes that they do? Well, if they didn't and they just arrested random people off of the street, right? Let's say we had effectively a P zombie police officer, right? And they're just arresting random people off the street because they don't know who to arrest, but that's the only button that they have to push, so to speak. We would say, wait a second, you're flooding the system with garbage, right? Now our adversarial system is getting overworked by these things where people don't have the rights and everything. So we say, oh, okay, well, education to solve that problem is good. We should have some administrative procedures so that way cops understand, the basics on who to arrest and who not to arrest, and what the paperwork looks like. So by the time it hits the court system, they do have these cases built up. The educated officer with an understanding of the world that they're in, an understanding of a deeper understanding of these procedures, the ability to reference and work through these things quicker than the uneducated cop because they're used to these tasks. That reading comprehension is present. The reasoning and logical faculties are present. The understanding of organizational management and business essentials is present. Right, like there's some core competencies that almost any degree is going to establish, combined with the advanced knowledge, especially for those later tasks. Now what I see is this officer sees something and they go, "Hey, this guy has some marijuana on him. Maybe I can bust him for that with what state we're in, but it's really not worth it." When I'm hearing these other calls on the radio go off, I'm hearing these other things, and further, what happened was we just kind of went up and grabbed his bag, and now there's these complications. I can see these potential legal complications to what's happening with the search, and I can kind of envision or imagine what the arguments would be in court in the moment. Because I'm seeing these things, I'm deciding to let this one go. So that way, I'm not adding more garbage to the system. I'm more likely to make stronger arrests because, again, I'm more aware of the overall context these things are happening in and how these systems work. I have a deeper understanding of that than some other officer that doesn't have the education and just kind of is following the procedure and whatever post said. It's such a massive boon to have an education to that performance. It allows that more. They're able to reflect and make these better decisions because they have more context informing the decisions they're making. So the direct link there to assisting the adversarial system is that. Now, if we want to compare that to say what someone in a legal department for a corporation would do, just as an example, right? You could have the corporation where the executives are just suing everybody that has a problem with them or just constantly paying out settlements. The reason that you have the educated person there looking at it is because they can tell which of those maybe is more likely to succeed versus not succeed. They're able to look at these situations and see where they're more likely to be successful or not. And so because of that, they're able to get quicker resolutions that are more on target for what the people want and what their job is than alternatives. And with law enforcement, it's the same way. We would want to see, okay, when the cop is making a traffic stop, not just that they dotted I's and crossed T's and it gets thrown into the meat grinder and there's hundreds of people lined up for traffic court now, but that instead we see, okay, when the cop is making that traffic stop, it actually means something that he's doing that. There's a reason behind it. There's an exceptional thing here that was actually a public risk that's actually worth the court's time. This officer has those tools available to make a better assessment of that than the alternative. Now, of course, they're not lawyers, they aren't the courts, but the context itself is what provides all of this value, and removing this context as a requirement means that we're basically just selling ourselves short on something we could be getting out of law enforcement. So I hope that's a direct enough answer for that. Let me know if I was unclear, but I hope that kind of the context overall is what's going to assist this.
So I think you're pretty clear. What it's probably going to keep coming back to is, even in situations like that, I can grant that there's a benefit to being more educated. But as we start talking about these more simple issues, it's a little bit less clear that more experience or either more law enforcement experience or just more life experience can't necessarily substitute for education. Like I was saying earlier, a cop is probably going to have quite a few months of basically of being babysat by a more experienced officer. I anticipate that experience is going to count for more than what it. I anticipate that experience is going to count for quite a bit more than an education when it comes to these sort of simple traffic decisions. To try to be a little bit more specific, if we have a traffic cop, I think there are two kinds of mistakes that they can make when they pull somebody over. They can make a mistake that gets themselves or somebody else killed, which I don't think an education is going to particularly prevent. Or they can make sort of procedural mistakes, or say they give somebody a ticket who maybe they really shouldn't have, or maybe they don't do the paperwork right and the case winds up getting thrown out, or maybe they even illegally search somebody. And hopefully, if the legal system is working right, they just the case winds up just getting thrown out, right? I think that there would probably be quite a lot of benefit to educating police officers. I think you've made some pretty good points there. But the strongest point that I think I have, and that I still don't think has been addressed right, is just like I said in my opening statement, we already have a shortage of people who are applying to do police work. Police departments already have difficulty retaining people. They already have difficulty hiring people. And increasing the requirements, just like it does in any profession, is only going to make the shortage worse. And like I said earlier, the harder it is to hire people, the harder it is to fire them, or the harder it is to justify firing them. And the less accountable police officers are going to be to the public or to their superiors. And given the objections people have had recently, people in the United States already feel like cops are not accountable enough. People already feel like cops can get away with doing whatever without consequences. I don't think making that problem worse is justifiable.
So let's talk about the police shortage really quickly, and let's talk about that, because I think I do agree. I think that's your strongest objection, right? To or your strongest supporting argument of the proposition. So let's spend a bit of time there. I think that it's more important to have the quality than not. And also, we have to look at what we mean when we say there's a police officer shortage in the U.S. And generally, what that claim means is, hey, there's departments saying that they want more staff and they don't have that staff on hand. Well, let's look at what the actual causes are of that. One is the population itself and its demand. The second is allocations of budget and things like that. Police departments really want to justify their budget so that they can keep getting really high training budgets and things like that. So there's these administrative things where we're requiring police to do so much, and we're putting them in places that, frankly, we shouldn't be putting cops, and that we would be satisfying these roles with, you guessed it, other people that are educated. So such as that role of the social worker. In Walt land, that would be my goal. It would be, let's have social workers do the social work and police do the policing, and narrow the focus. And maybe in that world, you and I could agree that education requirements could be lessened in this specific world. And that may be the common ground that we find. But we're not putting our cops in that position. We're having our cops do everything. And as a result, we've created a very stressful policing job, and we also we have all of this in the background of a very authoritarian state with the U.S. We have a tremendous amount of police enforcing petty crimes in areas on the poor. We have a lot of these issues where we're saying, oh well, we need police officers for this, and this, and that's what's creating the demand. So paradoxically, what's creating the demand is the need for police officers to satisfy all of these functions that we and responsibilities we're putting on them that do require this education. Um, so if you want to remove those responsibilities from police officers, then yeah, I would be inclined to say sure. But if we're going to continue to have police act how they're acting, um, then we do need to address the reason for the demand is frankly the over policing of the U.S., the over criminalization of so many things in the U.S. Um, and that's going to be where the brunt of quote unquote police work is happening. Is on an account of these kind of petty crimes and victimless crimes and things like that. That's why there's a demand, right? Um, when police aren't enforcing those, typically what they're going to be busy enforcing are actual crimes with victims. We're talking like burglaries, we're talking robberies and assaults and things of that nature. Um, Community where I work security at, very near to me, I would have police officers leave calls that I had for shoplifting and things like that so that they could go respond to those. Right. And the shoplifting, while it does technically have a victim or a traffic issue I might report in my parking lot, may or may not have a victim. But I would prefer the police officers work on the burglaries and minimize efforts on something like shoplifting. Um, we over police, frankly. So it's kind of like saying that there's a shortage of officers in my mind is kind of on par with saying it's better if we over police. Um, and that to me just doesn't quite sit right. It doesn't seem to make much sense.
Okay, so to address that point, I don't necessarily think that we can trust police departments to say when they do or don't have a just when they do or don't have a shortage of officers. Just like how you can't trust any department, either in the government or in a corporation, to tell you what their budget should be. Right? They're always going to exaggerate, but I think that we can justify the view that we have a shortage of police officers by the behavior or the hiring behavior of police departments. Like I said earlier, the shortage in the area that I grew up in eventually got so bad that they were actually, which even I don't think they should be doing, they were hiring people 18 years old right out of high school just because they had such difficulty staffing their department. And I don't think that they would do that because of the liability of having people like that on the force. I don't think that they would do that unless they were genuinely hurting for applicants. You might think that we should have, or you might think that we should have fewer cops and that we should generally police less, but it's not clear to me that that's the case at all. I think most communities in the U.S. would prefer to have more rather than fewer cops, especially areas with high amounts of crime. I think when we talk about over policing, we don't normally talk about having a large number of cops out. We talk about incentivizing them or encouraging them or even allowing them to enforce laws that they really shouldn't be enforcing, or to basically harass the public with policies like stop and frisk, or the drug war, or some applications of like civil asset forfeiture. We don't really talk about over policing in terms of like there being too many cops out there. We talk about it in terms of what those cops are doing. I think if over policing just means having a large police presence in areas where they're needed, then there wouldn't really be a problem with it. In fact, most people would probably support that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this just kind of goes back to that point of, well, if we reduce the number of things that are criminal behaviors, especially these seemingly pointless petty victimless crimes, and we remove those from the enforcement problems that we give police, then the police workload is lessened, and as a result, it just follows that we have a lower demand for police. Right, the police are able to hit the actual asks and needs of the community, and that's just better. Um, I think most people would agree that's preferable. I don't want police to be wasting their time going through some college student's bag for weed. I would prefer that my police are out there stopping a burglary or stopping an arson or something like that, doing something substantial. Um, and a lot of these petty crimes and other ethical issues are what's creating the demand. So if we were to have educated officers, then these educated officers, where they're not having to go out and enforce all these petty crimes, are now enforcing the real crimes and doing a better job, with that added context and knowledge and everything. And that just seems overwhelmingly more preferable. So not only upping the education standard to improve the operating knowledge and training basis for police, um, but also removing certain responsibilities from the police so that yeah, there's less demand, and then there's less stress for those officers as well. There's less emotional burnout. They're not so quick to get out of the profession or change departments to a more chill area or something like that. It just seems like we could walk and chew gum there with additional reforms to where we could still maintain these high police standards with an education. But in addition to that, we could also lower the amount of duties that police officers have, so that it's easier to keep them on a staff, and the demand lessens as a result of that as well. I don't know if you're open to that though. I think that would be really cool, frankly.
All right. So to talk about burnout and stress for cops, from what I understand, there are going to be two main sources of that. One of them is the amount of overtime that cops nowadays work, which I think is only going to be hurt by reducing the number of people we hire, and is obviously going to be helped by increasing the number of people we hire. And the other thing is that the worst part, from what I understand of being a cop, is going to be going to the sort of calls that you're specifically not talking about removing. Like, I don't know if cops who get traumatized or get PTSD because they pulled too many people over for speed traps or because they arrested too many kids for weed. Cops burn out, get PTSD, get traumatized because they go to like domestic calls, because they see the aftermath of like violent crime, or because they get involved in like violent altercations with the public. I also think that, given the way that most emergency services work, we don't really get to reduce the number of people on call, because they're not going to be, I don't know, arresting people for weed or stop and frisking people or spending less time in speed traps or whatever. We're still going to have those cops around in those communities. They're just not going to be doing they're just not going to be doing a lot of things that they're doing now. And so we might, if we ended something like the drug war or whatever, I'm sure we would lower the demand for police work, but it's not clear that it would be enough to make up for restricting the supply of applicants in the way that you're proposing.
I think it might actually help a lot, right? Because like when we talk about the drug war in particular, we're talking about a lot of stigma that's tied to the law enforcement um, uh, occupation as well, right? Because what do we say about cops that we don't like? Oh, these cops are just out there; they're just trying to bust people for nothing. It doesn't really matter. It's a waste of our time. We don't want them doing that. That's why I don't like cops. Is because they do nothing but interfere with my rights and hurt me and over stupid things that we all just like reject. And okay, great. So what if cops weren't that? What if cops were more in line with not stepping on your rights, but going out there and protecting you, like that genuine protect and serve mindset that we prefer in theory. Well, if that's the image of cops, if cops had a better image with the public, um, then probably there would be more people who are more likely to be open to that profession. And I think that if we're willing to talk about removing these other barriers then and the image of like what is a cop, right? Like which is the more marketable image? The cop as the educated helper in the community, going out there to keep the peace and kind of serve the people, um, who's aware and involved and connected. Is that a better image for a cop, or the uneducated um kind of like this drug war enforcer, right? And if we just had to paint a picture of those two images, like right, like I don't think there's any debate that um that the notion of an educated, aware police officer who's not busy trying to just keep people from living their lives, but is there to protect and really help. I think that's easier to sell than the kind of the current state that police are in the U.S. And perhaps that is as a product of the adversarial system and a lot of the other issues. I think law enforcement issues are really complex, and we could go into all the variables. And I don't think any solution is going to be a one shot to fix everything. And I think you and I likely agree on that as well. But I do think that it would be helpful for the image and probably alleviate a lot of the demand if people were willing to be cops, because cops conducted themselves better. And I think then the question kind of reverts back to that notion of, okay, we can see that an education provides additional context for cops to make better decisions and enable some better decisions, but doesn't mean that those decisions are more likely to happen. Um, Not necessarily, right? Like, so someone could be educated and still be a piece of shit. But when we go back to that and we say, well, you're educated, you're more aware, right? You're aware of the alternative options and creative solutions and finding these in real time, then yeah, like that's a door that's now open to you to do the right, to do more things that are in the direction of the right thing, than if you weren't aware, right? So it's like it's not that education is a clean fix to all of these issues. It's that education provides a an easier direction towards these solutions. And it's a good first step to be aware of what's going on, to be aware of these problems. And if we are demanding that awareness from the people that hold the most power walking around in our society, yeah, like that just seems like a prudent place to start. Um, and so I guess that's kind of where I would synthesize it all and kind of bring it all back together. I know we've been going for about an hour now. I'm happy to let that be my closing statement here, and give you the last word if you'd like. But
Yeah, I was actually about to suggest that. Okay. So to go over what we've been talking about the entire time, I think we've agreed throughout the conversation that there are benefits to having more educated police officers, especially if we have a requirement for education in relevant areas like social work, legal studies, criminal justice, and so on. Where we probably disagree is that I don't think that the benefits of increased education are sufficient to justify making a college education, either in a particular degree or just in general, an absolute requirement for police officers. I think that having experience in related areas or just more life experience in general can probably compensate for the deficit somebody might have educationally speaking. I think that we're better off having a larger supply of potential applicants for the police force, both because it lets us hire more people in general, reduce dangers of understaffing, and it also reduces, or it also allows police officers to be held more accountable if they misbehave, since we have a greater degree of, or we have a better ability to replace them. It's possible at some point in the future that we might reform the system such that it does become tenable to require a bachelor's degree for police officers, but I don't think we've got to that point yet, and I highly doubt that we will for at least the next few decades. In the meantime, I think that requiring a degree from police officers would most likely result in understaffing, reduced accountability for cops. It would most likely also move towards getting rid of one of the few remaining respectable, well-paying professions for people who don't have college degrees. And for that reason, I oppose that policy.